Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sara Bronin, the chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and I'm very glad to welcome you today to our policy chat. This is the first of a series of three presentations that we're doing this month to talk about three of the big policy proposals that we undertook, voted on, adopted in 2023. So I'll just mention, joining me today is Drew Null, who is our director rather. And Drew, if you could advance your slide, is the director of the Office of Policy and Legislative Affairs. So here we are, both live and on screen, so you can put faces to names. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the agency, we thought we would start by talking a little bit about the ACHP itself. So perfect. So just a big overview before we dig into our chat. The Advisory Council has 24 members. They are 9 federal agencies, as well as the Architect of the Capitol. There are 8 presidential appointees, of which I am one, and I happen to be the only full-time appointee. We have a governor, the governor of Delaware, a mayor, the mayor of Birmingham, and a tribal member, Chairman Reno Franklin, out in California, who joined the first 2 groups. And in addition, we have 3 organizational members, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, and the National Association of Tribal Preservation Officers. And so I tell you in that detail about our members because each of them brings a really critical perspective to the agency, and each of them votes on these policy statements that I'll be talking about today. The ACHP has 2 major functions, and I would say the bulk of the agency's work deals with overseeing the Section 106 review process. So this process was set out by the National Historic Preservation Act. It affects a total of about 120,000 federal undertakings, which is essentially a federal action, whether that's construction or funding or permitting or licensing. So everything the federal government does that has the potential to affect historic properties falls under this review process. I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But the second thing that the Advisory Council does is it advises the president and Congress and state and local governments on preservation policy. And both of these functions are outlined in the National Historic Preservation Act, and the Advisory Council takes both of them very seriously. So just focusing in for a moment on the Section 106 function, I wanted to bring to your attention the language from Section 106. And essentially what it says on the next slide is that it requires federal agencies to take into account the effects of their undertakings on properties on or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So this is about federal agencies' obligations to make sure that they understand before they act what kinds of impacts their actions will have on properties that are important to all of us. So the Section 106 process, again, a big part of what the agency does, and a part of the climate policy statement that we'll talk about today, but not the biggest part, as it turns out. So we have, on the advising front, among many other things, adopted 3 policy statements in 2023. So for those of you who've been following along, in March, we adopted, you may have heard about our policy statement, an update really on burial sites, human remains, and funerary objects. In June, we adopted the statement we're going to talk about today, the Climate Change and Historic Preservation Statement. We also, hot off the presses, adopted a policy statement on housing and historic preservation. Now, again, the first and the third will be the subject of later policy chats this month, but today we're focused on the climate change statement. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention before we get into the policy statement was who is involved. So in this case, there was a specific task force that was created to outline the concerns and the issues that were at the intersection of climate and historic preservation. The committee that Drew helps to lead, the Policy and Legislative Affairs Committee, composed of ACHP members, also has weighed in over a period of several committee meetings on the policy as it was drafted. We also have an experts advisory committee that is composed of professors, lawyers, other experts that provided some technical advice. In addition to those sort of internal committees, policy statements are also impacted by and advised upon by the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Offices and also individual state historic preservation offices and officers. We have a federal responsibility as well to meaningfully consult with tribal nations. And so that took place for this policy statement, as it did for the others as well. And through NAFPO and through other means, we also reach out to tribal historic preservation officers. So at the end of all of that input, discussion, consultation, the ACHP membership votes on a policy statement. And the impact of a statement at the end of the day relies on all of those who were involved in it, and also the general public, decision makers at all levels of government and private parties to really carry it forward. And so that's why we're here today, to really try to help you kind of dig into the details here and consider how you might be able to carry forward this policy statement. And so with that in mind, let's turn now to the policy statement itself. That is in New Mexico, is where that image is from. And first, just to say before I turn it over to Drew, who the intended audience is. And I just alluded to that in a bit, but in more, I guess, more specific terms, for sure, one intended audience of any policy statement that we pass is the federal government. We have so many federal agency members, so many entities that work on our council that work with federal agencies, that one primary audience for our policy statements is our fellow federal government actors. And a part of that and maybe a big part of that is that we have relationships as an agency, as an independent federal agency with other agencies through that 106 review process. And to some extent, this policy is intended to influence that 106 review process and try to make sure climate change is considered along with their historic resources. A second category of audience are other governments beyond the federal government. So state and local governments, that is certainly, it's in the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation Provisions in the National Historic Preservation Act. It says that we're supposed to advise and support state and local governments in what they do. And so a lot of what's in the policy statement is geared towards them. How can state and local governments take some of the principles and include them in their own decision-making processes? Tribal governments too, as sovereign nations, as partners in our historic preservation and cultural resource management and protection. Those are, again, partners with us and also part of the intended audience. We do understand in preservation in particular that there are a lot of community, nonprofit, neighborhood groups that can and should play a role in historic preservation. And we hope that they too are part of the folks who read our policy statements and consider adopting and moving them forward themselves. And that goes for what we call so all of these audience members are public serving institutions. That's how we call them in the policy statement. And we hope that with that all-encompassing term, we're talking not just about sort of the technical expertise that these governments and organizations might bring to the conversation, but to what we hope is their mission to ultimately serve the public in balancing these goals of climate and historic preservation and trying to bring them both forward. So with that, a bit of an overview, I'm going to turn it over to Director Null, who is going to walk us through the policy principles themselves, highlighting some key topics, and then I'll come back around at the end. So take it away.
Thank you very much, Sarah. basically the sort of what I call the guts of the policy statement are a series of policy principles. And we're not going to touch on every single one of them today, but some of the key ones, starting with those at the very beginning, which are fundamental, which is about gathering information and basically planning for climate change, planning for adapting to climate change. Now, in terms of gathering information, what the policy statement is talking about is, first of all, the notion that, well, obviously, as we all know, you can't protect historic resources if you don't know that they're there or you don't know what they are. So there's importance for going out and making sure that there's an understanding of what historic properties are there, ideally mapping them, geolocating them, so it's very clear exactly what is in what area. And in this case, in the context of climate change, the idea is to look for the look first to prioritize, to look first at the areas where there is the highest potential for climate impacts. And there's kind of two pieces of that. On the one hand, you can anticipate where direct climate impacts might happen. Modeling allows you to know where sea level rise is going to be the worst, for instance, or where wildfire might take place in a potential high impact zones. So you can have those kinds of anticipated vulnerable areas. Then kind of a second part of it is one can also anticipate where adaptation projects might take place that will impact historic properties. For instance, anticipating where those areas that are most very likely to potentially be developed for solar fields, for instance, or have the kind of winds one might need for wind turbine construction. You know that those are areas that might see climate adaptation projects being proposed. It would be a good idea to get ahead of the curve and know what historic properties are in those areas so that they can be better protected. As part of gathering information, the policy statement also talks about the need to consider indigenous knowledge and to make sure that adaptation and mitigation strategies address it and learn from it. And the definition of indigenous knowledge that is frequently used and that we use in the policy statement is, you see here, a body of observations, oral and written knowledge, innovations, practices, and beliefs developed through interaction and experience with the environment. Basically, the interaction of tribes over millennia in terms of what they have learned about the way nature works and how they interact with it. And this is very important not only for helping to identify historic cultural resources of concern to tribes, but also for what they have learned about how to, as I said, interact with nature and work with nature. Classic example being a lot of indigenous knowledge that informs how tribes have traditionally dealt with wildfire issues and how that can help in dealing with the accelerating problem of wildfire due to climate change. In terms of planning for climate change and planning for adaptation, it's critical in all of these scenarios, whether it's climate change planning or implementing those plans or disaster preparedness, that consideration of cultural resources be essentially baked in to these, that it be integral to these, that it be there from the very beginning in order to make sure that addressing historic properties then is as simple as it can be and is not an afterthought, basically. And this, in terms of planning for climate adaptation, this really is both. You're going to have large infrastructure projects, for instance, that are going to, as I mentioned, whether it's solar fields or wind farms or protecting seawalls, that sort of thing, and other kinds of resilient infrastructure projects. And you've got to make sure that historic properties are considered during the planning of those kinds of infrastructure projects in order, as I said, that they not be essentially overlooked. Similarly, in terms of implementing adaptation projects, that's going to run the gamut. But one thing that we call out specifically in the climate policy statement is kind of one of the most difficult ones, and that is the notion of community relocation, of people moving in response to climate change. You're going to have people moving into communities, out of communities, and even within communities as climate continues to impact those communities. For instance, you could have, even in just one city, people moving out of flood-prone areas, for instance. What is that then going to mean for the historic resources in those areas? Are they then abandoned? Are they neglected, et cetera? Similarly, you're going to have people moving into less risky areas and communities. What's the development pressure then on historic properties that are in there, in those areas? And then, like I said, the most extreme example is whole communities that basically have to be relocated. We've been beginning to see this in Alaska, in Louisiana, and it's a very difficult consideration when you, in terms of the context of historic properties. Are some structures, for instance, moved along with the community? Obviously there's some types of resources you can't just pick up and move. How does the community not lose its sense of self that it gets from historic properties when they have to up and move? And how do you try to help the community navigate that? Basically, when we flag these in the policy statement, what we're saying is that, quote unquote, public serving institutions need to be thinking about this and need to start taking action on each of these. We're not trying to necessarily lay out exactly what that action should be, but that it needs to be considered and needs to be action taken. And then with disaster preparedness and response, obviously a lot of climate change is gradual. It's long-term. It's sea level rise, incremental sea level rise. But then, of course, there's aspects of climate change that are very abrupt. They are natural disasters, be it extreme weather events, wildfire, whatever. So disaster preparedness likewise also has to have baked into it consideration of historic properties. And basically, this would be both in disaster preparedness planning for communities, as well as then what that plan says should happen literally during the disaster. And then finally, post-disaster, how are historic properties going to be addressed? And consideration, building that into the original plan is essential. The next policy principles deal with climate change mitigation and issues of equity. Now, climate change mitigation, for the purposes of when we talk about climate change and mitigation, which is very different than mitigation under Section 106, for those of you that deal in Section 106. In this context, mitigation means actions that are taken to essentially reduce climate change, to reduce the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere, to remove carbon from the atmosphere, to literally slow down climate change and reduce it. And in this respect, there are really two kind of sides to this when it comes to historic properties that are addressed in the policy statement. One is that reusing historic buildings and energy retrofitting them actually helps to fight climate change. Because whenever you reuse an historic building, you are not incurring the carbon emissions that one would incur from a new building. Because basically you have the embodied carbon of an historic building, and that is already spent carbon, as it were. And you're not expending more carbon either through the development of all the new construction, through the manufacturing, the transportation of new materials, basically the disposal and removal of the historic building. All of that carbon does not need to be expended if you reuse an existing building. Likewise, if you take an existing building and energy retrofit it, you are reducing the operational emissions from that building as well. And since basically 40% of America's housing stock or building stock is at least 50 years old, it is absolutely critical that reusing historic buildings be used as an effective tool for mitigating climate change. Now, so on the one hand, reuse existing buildings, historic buildings, as a way to fight and reduce climate change. On the flip side, a little bit of a flip side here is, of course, you're going to need clean energy projects, and going to need climate-friendly transportation in order to fight climate change. But both of those things are going to result in impacts to historic properties. So while on the one hand, you're using historic properties to fight climate change, on the other hand, fighting climate change can impact, sometimes negatively, historic properties. So how do you address this? On the one hand, you need to expedite those clean energy projects. You want those clean energy projects and that climate-friendly transportation to proceed. But on the other hand, you need to do that expediting in a way that still considers the impacts to historic properties. Obviously, in the context of Section 106, we talk in the policy statement about the need for Section 106 and other environmental reviews to be expedited in order to help move these clean energy projects and transportation projects along. But it's still important that, that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and that cultural resources are still considered. This is particularly the case regarding sacred sites and landscapes and properties of religious and cultural significance to tribes and NHOs, or Native Hawaiian organizations. And that's because some of these large clean energy projects have huge landscape scale impacts. And it's those very landscapes that are often of traditional cultural and religious value to tribes. So there's always a potential there that needs to be very carefully considered. Moving on to the issue of equity. This is a very important question because as recognized in the policy statement, historic properties historic properties of interest to disadvantaged and underserved communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And then these disadvantaged and underserved communities usually lack the economic and political capital to effectively address the fact that their resources are being impacted in this way. I mean, studies have shown that low-income residents and people of color disproportionately live in flood zones in urban areas, may live in older housing stock that is difficult to or has high operational cost and may be expensive to energy retrofit, et cetera. So it's very important that this disproportionate impact be considered during planning. Also, the fact that these groups, as well as particularly also Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and in general, the disadvantaged and underserved communities, as I said, lack capacity to participate in or to be initially represented sometimes in some of this planning and some of the environmental review. And thus, whether it's the federal government or state government, local governments, should consider options for expanding that capacity or supporting that capacity so that these groups that are the most vulnerable or the most impacted actually have a little bit more of a level playing field for participating in the solutions for what are going to be the impacts to historic properties of concern to them. And then the last couple of policy principles I want that the policy statement addresses: flexibility, education, and collaboration. I'm not going to talk too much about education and collaboration because they're fairly self-evident, but let's talk a little bit about the issue of flexibility. Flexibility is really important because climate change poses new and complex challenges, and it's on an accelerated timeline. It's moving very fast. So there needs to be a great deal of flexibility in how the federal government and all of us address it. On the one hand, one of the key issues that is discussed in the policy statement is the need to expand and be more flexible in the application of federal guidance on the treatment of historic properties threatened by climate change. And this is particularly important because that federal guidance is leveraged, whether it's the Secretary of Interior standards on rehab, or other types of federal guidance that are then used by states or local communities and adopted by them as their standards and guidance. Federal guidance really has a very broad-reaching ripple effect in terms of how historic properties are treated in the climate change arena. The policy statement pushes the idea that there needs to be more guidance. There's some really good guidance, federal guidance out there already, but there needs to be more. And it needs to be flexibly applied because we're dealing with, like I said, a unique situation that is moving very quickly. And sometimes some of the approaches that have been taken in the past, we essentially can't afford to take anymore, and need to take a little bit more of a flexible and kind of a revised look at this. And this is also the case with Section 106 reviews. It's not just the application of standards or guidelines, but also how our environmental reviews undertaken. The need to expedite, the need to be flexible in the consideration of alternatives, for instance, in the Section 106 process, in order to meet this incredible challenge while at the same time preserving and addressing historic properties of concern. Flexibility is also really important because, as the policy statement acknowledges, many historic properties are going to have to be altered to survive. I mean, if they're going to remain at all, they're going to have to change. Otherwise, they simply are not going to survive climate change. And that alteration, that inevitable alteration, is something that we have to contend with. And one way to do so is to be very flexible and creative. Likewise, the notion of helping communities understand and deal with the fact that a lot of historic properties are inevitably going to be lost to climate change. There needs to be triage in approach. There needs to be creativity, and there needs to be flexibility. And that, more or less in a nutshell, is some of the key provisions, the key policy principles that are set forth in the policy statement. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Sara to talk more about how the ACHP is taking this and moving it forward in implementation.
Great, thank you. And I do see some questions being dropped into the chat, and we'll certainly moderate those when we get to the end, just a few more slides. But do drop your questions in the chat. That's a great place for them, and we can try to address them. So just thinking about what the ACHP do when passing a policy statement like this. And if you go to the next slide, first thing, probably the thing that we can do the quickest or the most directly rather, is to implement and incorporate these principles into our own Section 106 process. So whether that is through guidance, whether that is through just different approaches, whether that is through identifying new types of projects and activities to tailor Section 106 processes to. Those are all within our wheelhouse. We also can help as part of our advising role, which is, again, clearly laid out in the Historic Preservation Act, advising and pushing for more flexible federal standards and more flexible application of standards at the state and local level. That was, as Director Null said, one of the principles that was enshrined in the policy statement. And it's something that I think we will try to carry forward. At the same time, so working at the federal level, we can also help to influence actions at the state and local level, draft legislation, and then raise awareness as well. So thinking about the Section 106 enhancements as just the first thing that we can do on the next slide, we can consider, as I said, issuing new guidance on that should say environmental issues and maybe what constitutes, instead of housing, although housing may be part of it too, Section 106 adverse effects, what is considered to be an adverse effect under our rules. That kind of guidance is something that we can think about how we approach as our agency in our process that affects so many other agencies. we can work to pull that phrase climate-friendly transportation out. And I did notice something in the chat which says, how does the ACHP define climate-friendly transportation? There are, we left it a bit open-ended, but I think the idea is types of transportation that might have less of an environmental impact. So for example, bicycle infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, certain kinds of public transportation that moves a lot of people for not a lot of energy, and so on. So thinking about that, we are working right now with the Department of Transportation to identify some aspects of that might benefit from thinking about different applications of 106. So stay tuned on that. That's a very timely question, and one that we are working on. The last thing that I wanted to mention, and Director Null just mentioned this, but the Indigenous Knowledge Policy Statement itself. So we mentioned Indigenous knowledge in the climate statement. We are working now to really flesh out what it means to respect and recognize Indigenous knowledge. And we expect to vote on that policy statement at our March meeting. By the way, all of our meetings are streamed to the internet somewhere from our website. So please feel free to find us in March when we will hopefully be adopting that policy statement live. There is a draft of it already on our website, so you can feel free to take a look at that and weigh in as you see fit. On that second bullet point in the what can the advisory council do slide, which is more flexible standards. So we did, and that's on the next slide, call for feedback on the Secretary of Standards in July of 2023. And we're soon to publish some suggestions about how we might apply and interpret those standards in a way that harmonizes them with the important climate goals that we also share, in addition to historic preservation. So again, that's coming soon. But I do think, as we think about what role can the federal government play, our standards, the ones that we use in 106, the ones that are developed at the Department of the Interior, the ones that state historic preservation offices use, and that local historic commissions use to make individual decisions about private properties. It's all related. And so really what we need to do together as preservation is just try to figure out what are the roadblocks to achieving a lot of goals at once, and how can we, as the advisory council, help to move that conversation along and to identify some issues. So this is really feedback and that we got from many different players, both from within and outside of the federal government. You yourselves may have provided feedback, and if you did, thank you very much for that. And again, we will be addressing that soon. So just going to that third thing that we can do, state and local advising. I will say that over the last few months, we have been hearing a lot about different strategies that state and local governments have used, some of them positively for preservation, some of them not so positively for our historic places. And our role as a federal agency in that is to really try to take what our members adopted as key policy principles and try to make sure that our counterparts at the state and local level have all the best information that they need in order to make the decisions that they need to do. So one example of proposed legislation that we had weighed in on just in an op-ed in the past, a proposed bill in Florida that would have I think in the name of resilience, ended up potentially threatening historic districts, especially those along the Florida coastline. There's another bill that's coming up that we hope to advise on in the near future, in a way that both protects historic properties, but also helps a state that has seen its fair share of natural hazards and disaster to ensure that its response appropriately considers historic properties. Recently, a week ago or 2 weeks ago, I was out in Charleston where local leaders are having robust conversations about how to zone for climate change and climate adaptation. So if any of you are from Charleston, what a beautiful city, but it really is on the front lines of a lot of local governments that are trying to figure out how to best ensure that a place with such, incredible history and incredibly well-preserved areas is able to both fortify those areas for climate change and also adapt them. So we're both helping, I think, to bring some best practices to local communities and to states, but also learning from them. And so thanks to the Preservation Society for hosting that. And then finally, on just the last thing we can do, that's exactly what we're doing right now, which is trying to raise awareness about our policy statement, about the ideas it contains, in the hopes that other people pick it up. So as I mentioned, later this month, the 20th and the 28th, we will be discussing our other two policies that we adopted in 2023. We're trying our best with social media to try to get just different aspects of these statements out into the world. Of course, we have lots of partnerships, both within the federal government and outside, and we welcome more. And so we really certainly appreciate you spending your time today to join us. And on our very last slide, if you are not on our mailing list or connected with us on all of these various social media channels that we have, of course, we welcome that. And again, thank you for being here. So with that, I think what we should do now is turn to some of the questions that are in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. So there's a couple from Jim, and I'll maybe read this out, and Drew, maybe you can take the first pass at this one, and then I'll pitch in if needed. The first question is, in encouraging retrofits, how do you resolve the potential conflict between the historic fabric of the building and the materials and techniques of energy retrofitting? So maybe we can talk about some of the things that we heard as we were developing that energy efficiency tenet of the policy principle.
Yes, thanks for that question. Basically, it is something of a myth that historic buildings cannot be energy efficient, for instance. Ironically, many historic buildings were actually built to be energy efficient, because those that were built long enough ago, that pre-air conditioning, et cetera, were actually built with a lot of passive energy efficiency components to them that, if reactivated, can actually be very efficient in helping with the efficiency of the building. Likewise, in terms of how do you balance the historic fabric of the building with the energy retrofitting, sometimes you do have to make compromises. That's where the flexibility part comes in. I mean, sometimes there will have to be changes in terms of while you're trying to preserve and reuse as much of the materials as possible, you may indeed have to make some changes to the structure, to the fabric, et cetera, to achieve a certain level of energy efficiency. I know that with the Energy Star efficiency rating, I believe it is 75, is kind of a general sort of definition that many historic buildings can easily meet, but it does mean that there has to be a balance struck. I mean, there sometimes have to be some changes made in terms of whether it's insulation, if you want to do solar, where do you do the solar panels in a way that is the least obvious or the least problematic. And there are definitely some trade-offs, but it is certainly not impossible and to do both things. You definitely can have a energy efficient historic building and a building that still retains its historic integrity. The General Services Administration, the nation's federal landlord, as it were, for federal properties, most federal properties, or many federal properties, I should say, has been doing some amazing stuff in terms of how they have taken courthouses and other such buildings and made them, LEED gold, LEED platinum in terms of their energy efficiency. So while I can't give you an exact answer, that the ultimate, the foundation is flexibility and creativity, basically.
Great. And I'll just add that Jim had some related questions and comments. And Another aspect of that, so we've talked about just the federal preservation standards. Another aspect of that, which Jim brings up in the comments, is energy codes and building codes. And in some cases, we have heard from developers and others who have said, property owners who have said, well, we really want to comply with, let's say, an energy efficient energy code, but sometimes that's kind of thing is seen as infringing on historic fabric. And so one of the things that the advisory council has pledged to look at in the policy statement is ways that we can influence or encourage greater harmonization with building codes and energy codes. And you'll see that mentioned not just in this policy statement, but also in the housing policy statement that we'll be discussing later this month. And for a variety of reasons, I mean, the whole reason we adopted this climate policy statement in the first place, that kind of harmonization is really imperative. It is important for us to enable, as Director Null said, the modernization of these buildings in sensitive ways that do address energy issues. How exactly where that kind of guidance goes. Is it in the codes themselves, something that the Biden administration has been trying to influence through a variety of initiatives, including through the Department of Energy? Is it in the historic preservation guidelines that are, again, considered at federal, state, and local levels, including guidance that's issued by both us as the ACHP for federal projects, those 106 projects, and the Park Service through the Secretary of the Interior standards. So where that goes, I think, is an open question, but the Advisory Council has said we are interested in that particular topic. And for me as an architect, I'm fascinated by how building codes can be harnessed to meet those goals. And a lot of that really is in those technical details and the provisions and getting somebody who knows building codes inside and out. So we've reached out to DOE, the Department of Energy, and we're hoping that we can play a part in those building code and energy code conversations. But if anybody from DOE is on the call, we are more than happy to work on that side, just as we're working within preservation as well. There's another question here about from Ross about what is the ACHP's approach if there's a recognition that historic properties may be altered to survive or may be lost. What is the ACHP's approach to helping or aiding communities to preserve their heritage or culture rather than buildings as communities navigate the world of land impermanence? And so this is a really interesting question. This is, I think, Ross, you're getting at the immaterial or the intangible aspects of cultural heritage. That's something that if you look at the terms of the National Register of Historic Places, it's something that that doesn't necessarily fit neatly into those categories that the National Register has set out. Since the beginning of its existence, it's really about the physical and the material. I think one of the really important things that's happening right now in the federal context is that we are looking at those intangibles. The Indigenous Knowledge Policy Statement that we're considering recognizes those intangibles and recognizes that those too are an important part of culture and history and memory and understanding of our past and ourselves. So, your question again is very timely here. As for the specific question of how ACHP assists communities, now we are not a grant making agency in that we don't have programs that specifically give money as a pass-through or otherwise to communities themselves. There are much bigger agencies that do that. But part of what we're trying to do in both raising issues that are important to tribes and others is to embed that kind of thinking in other agency programs and also try to elevate that in our relationships and our partnerships. I'll just give one example of that I'm trying to do in my own capacity, which is I was appointed by the president to serve also on the American Folklife Center of the Library of Congress. And a lot of what the Folklife Center does is to investigate, to understand, to elevate these intangible issues. And so I'm learning a lot in that role myself. And I think that it is going to become increasingly important for us to integrate those intangibles into our federal decision-making processes, but also into potentially, things like the National Register itself. Looking at other countries, that protection has been given to intangibles, and other countries have done it in a variety of ways. We just haven't in the US really taken that from a policy level. So what the ACHP can do, not direct grants, but really help across the federal government, us think about how we integrate those issues at the policy level. And so that's what we are working on in a variety of different ways. Drew, did you have anything to add to that?
There we go. Not to that particular question, is there?
Okay, great. Melissa asks a question about, do we have guidance coming out around related language about these issues in programmatic agreements with federal agencies? And so I think, Melissa, what you're asking about is, will we as an agency issue guidance on any of the topics that are touched on in the climate policy for 106 reviews generally? So for those who are unfamiliar, there's the 106 process, and then there are a variety of what we call program alternatives. There are 5 different potential paths that we might have an agreement with the ACHP and other federal agencies, or something like a declaration by the ACHP that certain types of projects should be treated in certain ways. I think, though, that when we issue guidance, we typically see it guidance documents, which are available on our website. We see those kind of, at least we try to write them in a way that affects 106 projects more generally. So as to whether we're issuing guidance on anything related to the climate policy, I will say that it's a little bit different than the way we wrote the housing policy statement, which specifically calls for us ourselves as an agency to issue guidance related to housing. Or maybe it's not explicit in the policy statement, but we had always said that for the housing policy statement, we'd issue updated guidance on certain housing issues that federal agencies and their grantees and licensees and permittees might deal with when they are dealing with housing. Embedded in that housing related guidance, I think we will be talking a bit about energy efficiency as well as potentially renewable energy. So there will be a climate dimension, I believe, to the guidance that we'll be issuing as part of the implementation of the policy statement. We'll have a little bit more to say about that later this month. On the climate side, we might be issuing maybe we'd be issuing some guidance, Drew. I don't know that we've committed to doing that yet, but I think what we are most likely to do is to follow the path that we've done for specific policy types. And I'll give one example of that. Last year, the Advisory Council, seeing an increase in federal government actions that involved the installation of electric vehicle infrastructure, we issued what we would consider to be an exemption, one of those 5 types of streamlining procedures that enabled federal agencies to, under certain circumstances, exempt their electric vehicle charging stations, whether they funded it themselves or they were building it themselves as part of a project, let's say part of a courthouse project, or part of a new federal government building. If they had electric vehicle charging stations, they can use this exemption for those types of stations that meet the criteria in order to exempt them from further historic preservation review. So I would imagine, the climate-friendly transportation, well, that would not be an exemption, at least not that I think we're thinking about it now. That kind of agreement would be something that we would probably most likely be the kind of thing that comes out of this, as opposed to guidance. So I don't know if that was clear, but we can issue guidance, we can come to agreements, and those are 2 separate tracks. I think for the housing policy, we might actually do both, but we've certainly committed to our members that we'll be issuing guidance. We haven't, I think, identified a specific guidance track for the climate statement. And again, Director Null, is that Did I get that right? I think we haven't sort of committed to that yet, but if you have specific ideas where guidance might be helpful, feel free to drop it in the chat.
Yeah, no, we haven't, like you said, settled on any particular guidance. I do know that our Office of Federal Agency Programs, who deals directly with Section 106 and works with agencies on that, has done at least one presentation on the policy statement to a particular federal agency who wanted to sit down and parse through the statement and talk about how it affected or they could implement it at their agency. So I know there's been more one-on-one discussions with agencies.
Great. So I think we have time for maybe two more questions. There's one international question and there's one regulatory reform question. So let me get to the international question first. And that is from Charles, who asked, are there examples from UNESCO's work and preservation to learn from, or other examples of adapting to climate change outside of the US, other governmental entities? So I will say, thank you for dropping a note in the chat. Certainly, we have our eye on, what's happening at UNESCO, and we have been newly involved with the State Department and some of their heritage aspects, and we hope to deepen that partnership with the Department of State. And I mentioned that just to say, I'm only the second full-time chair of this agency, and so, it's been a bit of a learning curve to see, well, where can we plug in where we haven't before? And I would say the State Department is really of course, is the federal agency that does the most in terms of international relations and diplomacy. But that cultural heritage aspect internationally and developing those relationships, that's where we domestically, the Advisory Council, can learn from and through their efforts. I'll also say that again, just in sort of just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that I get to do, just accepted an advisor role on the European Heritage Hub, which I believe is going to be a place where these issues are exchanged. So it's an EU initiative where ideas about these issues are exchanged. I've done a little bit of sort of reaching out myself to a couple of countries and their embassies here in DC. It's an area that I think we can learn a lot from other places. How we do that is to be determined. One of the things that the Experts Advisory Committee has on its next agenda is a conference that we convene here in DC on climate heritage issues. So I'll throw out there, if anybody out there is interested in helping to generate ideas for that conference, again, it would be an international a conference with an international angle, or would like to provide support for it in some way, please reach out. We'd be happy to include you in those conversations. But I do think one of the things that we need to do more of is just surface issues that other countries are facing and the solutions that they've tried, because we certainly can't say that we have it all under control here in the US. We don't, and we can do a better job if we learn from other places. So I think it's a very timely question. It's something that's on our mind now. And if there are other ideas out there, of course, always send them our way. And so for that, I think we have maybe time for one last question. And maybe this is an opportunity to explain how the Advisory Council's regulations work. And it's Adam's question on whether the ACHP considered revising the definition of emergency situations to broaden the applicability of emergency preparedness. And just for those of you who are not in the weeds on the federal government, before I turn this over to Director Null to answer that question, federal regulations are written by agencies to help flesh out information that might be only broadly sort of set out in a statute and something Congress passes. So Congress passes a statute, they hand it over to the agency, and they say, you promulgate these regulations on point. We're responsible for promulgating the regulations on Section 106 and all of those processes that are associated with it. So what Adam is pointing out here is a provision that relates to emergencies, one that helps federal agencies understand what they're supposed to do when there's not enough time to go through the whole Section 106 review process. As we know, again, we didn't do a lot of climate science or climate background on this call because I think we maybe assumed that everybody here knew that These events are increasing in number, increasing in frequency, and increasing in impact. So I mean, if that wasn't sort of maybe a baseline piece of knowledge, those are the facts. So with the number of potential emergencies increasing, so I'll turn it over to you, Drew. Have we considered revising those regulations yet? And what might be some issues related to revising regulations?
Yeah. The key issue is that it's that unlike issuing a policy statement, the ACHP cannot relatively quickly and easily revise its regulations or tweak its regulations. Revising federal regulations is a very complicated, lengthy process. It's not usually done just to change one little piece. Generally, regulatory reform or changes takes a very comprehensive look at the entire regulation. It's not something that we can just go in and say, 800.12 needs a tweak. Here's what we've come up with. So it's difficult for us to make that kind of laser focused change. That's why I kind of don't envision something like that happening anytime soon, because we really aren't, to my understanding, at a place where we are interested in or feel the need to revise the entire Section 106 regulation. Now, that's not to say that we can't work with agencies within the confines of that definition to approach how it is applied, and maybe not broaden its applicability, but approach how it is applied. And I know we've certainly done that in terms of programmatic approaches to emergency situations using the 106 regs. If Jamie Leutchinger who is the director of our Office of Federal Agency Programs, is on the call and wants to weigh in the chat or even just weigh in, I'd welcome that. There's Jamie. Did you want to add to what I just said?
Just that, I think not long after Chair Bronin came on, we actually did an analysis of the regulations and found that they were working.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And then also, we do have extensive guidance on 800.12 and regularly provide webinars on that topic, and certainly emphasize the flexibility within that section of the regulations when agencies are coming across disasters or emergency situations or preparedness situations as well. So, thanks.
Thank you for that. And I was going to bring that up because, for me, as a new chair, somebody coming in, I said, well, let's do, early on in my tenure, I said, let's hear from our members about which provisions in our regulations, because it's not just, and I put the link to 812 in the chat, it's not just this one, but there are some other issues that maybe, well, if the members felt we really should open this up, the time to do it is at the beginning of someone's term, so that it can, at least in theory, somehow be wrapped up, the lengthy process by the end. And if you look at the language of 800.12, it's broad enough that if we needed to say more about it and to maybe identify more specifically when it's at issue and what a federal agency might do, that's where Jamie's office, Director Leutchinger's office, would issue guidance to that effect. And so we do have these other tools with the agency other than direct revisions to regulations. I wouldn't say that we, will never amend anything across federal government. Of course, that regulatory reform, regulatory review happens all the time. But at least for now, we decided that we are good as is. Okay, it's 1:00. I can't tell you how grateful we are for your participation, for your interest. We hope you do join us for the next 2 policy chats. You've raised some really great issues. We will log any suggestions that were contained in the chat and think a little bit more about some of the questions. So really appreciate it. Do stay in touch, and we will see you maybe on February 20th. Thank you, everybody.